All right, in this video we want to discuss the microbiology of the skin. Whenever we introduce a new organ system and try to understand the diseases that target that organ system, we want to start by understanding the basic anatomy of the organ system, the defenses that organ system has against infection, and then the microbes that normally make that organ system home. So here we'll begin with skin. And let's begin by thinking about the anatomy of the skin. So the skin is divided into three basic layers from the outside to the inside. Those would be the epidermis, then the dermis, and finally the most inside will be called the dermis. We're going to focus on the epidermis and the dermis. Here you can see the epidermis is the outermost layer, the dermis is the layer below that. And then again, there's also this hypodermis, which falls below the dermis. We won't really be considering the hypodermis in terms of the microbiology of the skin. So if we understand that these layers exist, next we should consider some of the specific details about each layer that are important to us. So here's another diagram that represents the epidermis as the outermost layer, and then the dermis as the layer below that. And again, we've got the hypodermis below those two, but we won't be addressing the hypodermis. So let's start by just listing a few important characteristics of that epidermis. So we'll begin with the epidermis. The epidermis is primarily made out of one cell type. There are lots of cell types in there, but the vast majority, something like 90% of the cells in the epidermis, are these things called keratinocytes. These cells are called keratinocytes because they produce tons of keratin. And keratin is a structural protein that provides this layer with a lot of strength. That keratin makes the layer relatively impermeable. It's hard for things to get through it. And that's true for water especially. The keratinized surface makes the skin relatively water resistant. So this layer, the epidermis, really acts as a barrier to infection because it's got all these keratinocytes making so much keratin. It's really strong. And again, it's hard for pathogens to penetrate this layer. Again, this layer, because it's hard to penetrate, it's also harder for water to cross that membrane. So the epidermis has this limited water permeability, and that's meant to help decrease our water loss to the environment. That's a really important component of skin activity. So the epidermis is this strong keratinized layer on the outermost surface. The dermis is the next layer in. What are the basic characteristics we should understand about the dermis? And I think the point I would like to hammer home is this is where all the sort of living structures of the skin reside. So here's where you're going to find the hair follicles from which hairs grow. Here's where you'll find the sweat glands. We'll also find these sebaceous glands that we'll talk quite a bit about. We'll find the blood vessels here because we need the vasculature to provide nutrients to these living tissues. So we've got this epidermis, these heavily keratinized cells that make up the outermost surface. And then just below that, we've got these thriving living tissues, all the glands, follicles, and then all the vasculature that feeds those living tissues. And for us in microbiology, that's really the extent of what we need to know about the anatomy of the skin. So next, let's think about the defenses of the skin. So what keeps the skin from being infected with microorganisms? And the very first thing is that these outermost cells on the skin that you can see in this electron micrograph are heavily keratinized. Again, keratin is a structural protein. It provides these cells with a lot of strength. It connects these cells together to make an impermeable surface. And so that keratinization is a really important characteristic of the skin. Next, the epidermis has this characteristic where skin cells are constantly sloughing off. So we've probably all heard really gross statistics about like how much of dust is actually dead skin cells and things like that. You can see in this electron micrograph that each skin cell is a little sort of tile or shingle on this surface. And as these cells, these keratinized cells, reach the outermost layer, at this point they're dead, and they only exist on this outermost layer for a day or so, before they essentially just fall off of the skin. And they'll be replaced by cells underneath that are constantly growing. So we've got these growing cells at the bottom of the epidermis, and as the cells move up through the epidermis, they reach the surface when they're dead, and they begin to fall off. And so that falling off is just referred to as sloughing off. And so let's refer back to this electron micrograph one more time to think about why that's beneficial. So in this, we can actually see there's a couple bacterial cells attached to the surface of the skin over here. And then up here, there's several more bacterial cells attached to the skin. So these cells could potentially cause an infection. But because our skin cells are constantly sloughing off, this cell that these microbial cells are attached to is eventually going to fall right off of the skin surface. And when it falls off, it's going to take these microbes with it. So living on the skin is a really difficult place for microbes to attach. And that's one of the important defenses of our skin, the constant sloughing off of these cells. That sloughing off will carry any potential pathogens away from the skin with them. So what else? Our skin is also rich in all sorts of antimicrobial substances or chemical defenses. So the chemical defenses of the skin are pretty straightforward. There is a chemical called sebum. Sebum is really important in the pathogenesis of acne, and so we'll think more about sebum later. But sebum is an oily and acidic secretion for the skin. So this creates an environment that only some microbes can survive in. Specifically here for the skin with a pH of about 4.5 to 6.2, sebum helps select for acidophiles. And so that's reducing the number of bacteria that are capable of growing on the skin because it's a slightly acidic environment. We've also got our sweat. Sweat is rich in salt, and so our skin is a relatively salty place. So this means that only halophiles can survive on the skin. Almost every body secretion contains lysozyme. Lysozyme has come up many times in our microbiology course. Lysozyme is important because it breaks the glycosidic bonds in the bacterial peptidoglycan cell wall. That weakens the bacterial cell wall and leaves them open to lysis and premature death. The final thing you might find, or the thing we'll focus on for the skin, is that our skin cells produce these things called antimicrobial peptides, or AMPs. Antimicrobial peptides are just small proteins that kill microbes or harm microbes. Mostly, these antimicrobial peptides are thought to disrupt microbial membrane function. They might pierce holes in the membranes or disrupt flow of nutrients across the membrane. So by creating these peptides, we can defend our skin from pathogens that might try to infect the skin. So those are all the defenses of the skin. With the structure of the skin and the defenses of the skin in mind, next we should think about what are the normal microbes that inhabit the skin. So in general, for something to live on the skin, they have to be able to survive in relatively dry, salty conditions. So in general, we find halophiles growing on the skin. And then we know that also they might be slightly acidophilic. But the most common genus of bacteria that we find living on the skin are Staphylococcus and Streptococcus. We find plenty of Cutibacterium, Corynebacterium, Acinetobacter, and Pseudomonas living on the skin. And again, they have these traits in common of being halophiles, and that's why they can survive on the skin. What I don't want us to do is memorize the identities of bacteria that live on the skin. But as we study the diseases of the skin, it's really important for us to know if a disease is caused by an endogenous microorganism, one that was already living there and it's causing an opportunistic infection, or is the disease caused by an exogenous organism, one that we don't normally find living on the skin. So we provide this list of microorganisms only so that we can have a better idea of the origin of the microbes that are causing diseases of the skin as we study individual diseases. The last thing we'll say about the microbes that live on the skin is that they're most abundant in the moist areas, like our skin folds or near hair follicles, next to glandular ducts that are secreting things like sweat or sebum. The more vast, dry patches of our skin are much less inhabited by microorganisms. All right, so we know about the structure of the skin, the defenses, what microbes grow there. The last thing we'll say about the skin is we'll just address some of the lesions that we see in the skin associated with disease. So many diseases of the skin are classified that way because they present with particular skin lesions. So the diseases we might study this semester would include things like acne. Acne is associated with all sorts of skin lesions like pustules, cysts, and papules. Another example would be chickenpox. The chickenpox lesions are known as pustules. Measles and rubella present with skin lesions. They're macules or papules. The measles rash is often referred to as a maculopapular rash because it contains these lesion types. The last one I might mention here is ringworm. Ringworm presents with this rash that includes a crust. So the diseases that we are going to study that affect the skin often include skin-specific lesions. So we'll keep the identities of those in mind when we study those specific diseases. But that's where we'll end talking about the skin. As always, if you have any questions, I hope you'll let me know, and I'll talk to you all very soon.